Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to part 1 of a part 4 series which will feature an in-depth analysis of the Aimchess Rapid tournament that was played between Magnus Carlsen and Wesley. So let's get right into it. The reason this is a 4-part series is because I really wanted to go for a in-depth analysis rather than just quickly overview what happened each game. And if I were to do this all in one video, the video would be way too long, or it just would be too brief and wouldn't cover everything I wanted to talk about. We get a Catalan with bishop e7. This has been the sort of traditional line that has been played for decades pretty much, as the most played line in the Catalan. Here we castle, and Wesley takes Magnus's pawn. The point of this capture is to make it so that even though you're giving away one of your central pawns, White's going to have to spend time to recapture this pawn with either moves like queen a4 or queen c2 or knight e5, which is going to take, a multiple tempo. Here Magnus plays queen a4. Queen a4 is the third most popular move based on the database. It's not the best move because black is technically able to equalize, but because it's a rapid game and not a classical game, there's really no disadvantage to playing queen a4, as, trying to punish those tiny nuances would be a very difficult goal to do with 15 minutes on the clock. And by the way, the time control for this event is 15 minutes with 3-second increment, meaning that after each move, each player gets 3 seconds back on their timer. And queen a4 is by no means a bad move, it's just not the best move based on theory. Here, Wesley so plays e6. The point is that if you don't take this pawn immediately, Wesley would play b5, and now this pawn would be not capturable, and the queen would get kicked out. So Magnus captures the pawn, b5, and the pawn comes out with tempo, and is forced to retreat. Here, Wesley plays bishop b7, which was really the only move Wesley could have played, because if he were to play something else, let's say just bishop d7, knight e5 would have been an extremely difficult move to play against. Now this rook is attacked by the bishop. This knight is going to capture this bishop, and White would have the bishop there, and it's a very, very comfortable middle game and endgame. And if something like rook a7 would be played, this would be a super awkward spot for the rook, because the rook is much better on ace8 rather than a7. And the reason for that is the rook is able to maneuver over to d8 or c8, wherever it needs to go, whereas on a7 it really doesn't serve much purpose. Yeah, so obviously, instead of that, Wesley plays bishop b7, which is the main move. We're still in theory. There's been numerous thousands of games played in this position. Here, the main move is bishop d2. Black plays bishop e4, and the point is just to place the queen on an awkward square. There really is no good square for the queen here. So Magnus follows theory of queen c1. The difference between queen c1 and, let's say, queen d1 is that this pawn becomes a little bit vulnerable, and so if somehow this pawn was to be captured, which is not entirely out of the question thanks to the vulnerability of this knight, this pawn could become a big target if the queen was on d4, let's say. After queen c1, Wesley plays c6, and now we're completely out of theory. This position has been reached like 3 times in total, and it's not a bad move, but it's a slight inaccuracy because c6 isn't entirely the best move. This knight has difficulty developing, but the point of this move is that you're just reinforcing this d5 square. And if this bishop was to get attacked with, let's say, knight c3, black could just drop the bishop back, and after taking, black would have an entirely solid center with very well protected pawns, and we would just have a very equal middle game. And here Magnus plays e3, solidifying his own center. The engine does not like this move that much because it thinks that this bishop is far too passive. It doesn't really have any purpose anymore. However, Magnus does not agree with the engine, and for good reason, because after knight bd7, Magnus plays knight c3. Wesley in this position decides to bring the bishop back. The reason is if Wesley was to allow this capture, let's say Wesley was to play rook c8, which is a pretty fine move, but black is just a little bit worse here after this capture occurs. And the reason that white is better in this position is just because of the weakness of this c6 pawn. So eventually this knight is going to get out of the way. Our f3 knight is going to move. A rook is going to happen to be on c1. And all of a sudden, this pawn is super weak, and it becomes a big weakness in the middle game and end game. So 10, 15 moves down the line, this weakness is going to become prominent. Right now, it's kind of hard to explain without seeing like an entire game played in this variation. But basically, from here on out, this whole game would rely on this c6 pawn, and black would desperately try to protect it, while white would expand in the center and just get much more space and a better initiative. So instead of that, Wesley sends the bishop back. Here, Magnus plays knight h4. The purpose being is to take this bishop and just have a bishop pair with no bishop pair for black. Wesley does not want to make this sort of exchange by playing bishop h5. Here Magnus plays queen e1, which is a very beautiful move. If you guys notice something, this pawn is hanging here, But white cannot ever take this pawn because after rook c8, and let's say this trade was to occur, there's a lot of problems in white's position here. First of all, b4 is coming. This knight is pinned to the queen. The knight cannot move because then the queen would be hanging. And second of all, this knight is capturable, after which this pawn would also be hanging. So if, let's say, white played queen e1 to hide the queen away, this would be a move too late because after this capture was to occur, black could play bishop f3. This pawn would still be hanging, has nowhere to go, and this position is just awful for white. White has to sacrifice some pieces if we go down the line. So, for example, move here could be h3, just trying to make some space for the king. Otherwise, the king is cramped, like it has no moves at all. The queen captures the pawn, and now this pawn is hanging. This g2 checkmate is coming, so the king has to go to h2 to protect and reinforce this pawn. Then the knight comes to f6, and suddenly white has no reasonable defense because knight g4 is coming with check, and the h3 pawn cannot capture this knight because, once again, the queen is staring down the king. Rook g1 is pretty much forced here. And after this exchange, I mean, white is just down material, and white has to somehow protect this pawn with moves like queen f1. This is very, very passive, and black is in a much better spot here, thanks to the extra material. That sums up why bishop taking on c6 is not possible. So first of all, let's talk about the purpose of queen e1. So queen e1 removes the queen from the site of a potential c8 rook, making this capture possible in the near future. But also, the purpose of queen e1 is to create this queen-bishop battery and apply pressure on the queen through a move like bishop a5, which would make the queen so passive because the queen has no development squares after bishop a5. This is kind of hard to visualize right now, but you guys will see down the line how it plays out, and it's just such a odd but very beautiful move. It also opens up ideas like rook c1, which would apply more pressure on the c-pawn. Wesley plays rook c8, which is just to reinforce this pawn. Magnus drops the knight back in order to open up this queen-bishop battery. Also prepares knight f4, which would apply more pressure on the light square bishop. Here Wesley plays c5, and the point is just to trade this pawn off because it's such a big vulnerability, it's such a big weakness to have that pawn on c6, where it's targeted by this bishop. So c5 is a necessary move. Magnus strikes with bishop a5, forcing the queen to go to e8. And after knight f4, this bishop has no good squares. After, let's say, bishop g4, preventing this trade, just h3, and this trade is inevitable. So Wesley just drops the bishop back to d8. And I think the purpose behind this move was, well, if you take my bishop there, I'll take your bishop there. But unfortunately, this does not work with Wesley because after the knight captures the bishop, if this bishop was to take on a5, Magnus would have this very nice intermediate move with knight f6 check, forcing black to recapture, and black would just be down a piece at the end of it. So after Magnus captures this bishop, Wesley is forced to capture back with the knight, and Magnus keeps his bishop there. Here Magnus drops back to f3, and the reason for that is taking this bishop is not a good look for black either way, because with the queen on a5, the a6 pawn is hanging, and there's only one way to protect it, which is with knight b8. Let me just show you guys an example of what I mean. Let's say this was to occur. Black cannot play rook a8 here because, once again, knight e5 comes with very dangerous attacking chances. So after knight e5, rook a7, for example, there's even knight c5, which is just a crazy move. But basically, white is just much better in this position. Even after taking this knight, white is just up an entire free pawn. And so the only move to protect a6 would be knight b8, and here it's super passive. I mean, the knight is back on b8, white has much better development. Pretty much all of black's main pieces are on the 8th file, so they haven't developed at all, except for this, which is on the rim of the board, and it also serves no purpose. So obviously the prospects of that were not very appealing, and Magnus decided that it's fine to keep the bishop on a5. And Wesley obviously saw that and decided to not trade the bishop. Black plays knight f6. The purpose of that is just to activate the knight once again. The knight on h5 is pretty obsolete, as it doesn't really target any squares, and it can develop itself to a, better one. Magnus plays rook c1 with the purpose of attacking this pawn and also preventing this pawn from taking. It's a very clever move because Wesley wants to get rid of his bad c-pawn, but is unable to do so because if this trade was to occur, this rook would be actually hanging, and this would be devastating, right? Just hanging this upper rook and threatening to take this bishop. Wesley here plays c4, and now this pawn is slightly overextended, but this is something that you guys will see a lot if you play the Slav defense or if you play the Catalan with moves like a6, b5, and c4. And sometimes there's also a pawn on c6. And the point is that white has a lot more central control, so black tries to take over the queen side by putting all of his pawns on the light squares and trying to get activity from that. Here are the main ideas for why are usually a4 or b3, which is exactly what we see executed by Magnus after b3. And once again, this pawn is unable to capture this b3 pawn because then the rook would be hanging. And so Wesley's in a little bit of trouble now. And after knight d5, Magnus simply captures this pawn, breaks the pawn structure apart for Wesley so now these pawns are isolated, and then plays e4, kicking this knight out. As it once was on f6, it has to go back now because it has no other squares. And so in this position, I'm sure a lot of you guys would consider the move e5, but this move is counterintuitive because it just allows the knight back on d5, and it would serve no purpose. I mean, this position is still fine for white, but now these pawns are kind of stuck here, and this knight is on a very nice outpost square. So instead of that, Magnus plays the bishop back, because here, say Magnus just played a random move like rook c2. After this trade would occur, Wesley was going to be able to take this e4 pawn, and after queen takes a6, it's really hard to say if this trade was worth it, because this e4 pawn falls. Now this d4 pawn is isolated. It becomes a pretty large target, but white does have a, fast pawn on a2, although it becomes a very difficult pawn to actually promote because very quickly, black is able to place a rook on a8, for example. And even though Magnus would still be up an entire pawn, the a6 pawn just isn't worth as much as the e4 pawn, as it takes up so much of the center and it's just a much more active piece. Regardless, Magnus draws the bishop back to c3, after which Wesley just develops his knight to a nicer square. This opens up opportunity for his queen to move out. Here Magnus plays queen e2. The point is just to apply more pressure on this c4 pawn. Wesley plays bishop e7, but it's a slight mistake because here Wesley needed to reinforce this pawn and add even more protection to it. The problem with bishop e7 is it's too slow and it presents a superficial threat. For example, bishop a3 doesn't really work. The rook just slides up. Regardless, Magnus decides to move the rook out of the way either way. And then knight a4 is played, which is just a little bit too slow. The purpose of knight a4 is to capture this bishop and, take away white's bishop pair. But after rook b1, suddenly this pawn is hanging. There's no way to protect it. For example, queen c6, there's knight e5, which attacks both the queen and the pawn, giving white a substantial advantage. If, let's say, queen a5, queen a4, there's still knight e5, and there's just no way to protect this pawn. So Wesley decides that he's going to target the e4 pawn, and after this exchange occurs, white is still up a pawn after queen takes a6. However, here, Magnus plays knight e5, which does not take away from a6 in any way, targeting this knight. And the only move that I can save the knight here is queen e5, which is exactly what gets played. Magnus drops the queen back in order to further apply pressure on this pawn, and here Wesley is forced to play a weakening move with f5. However, it's the only move that once again holds the position together. Here white just takes the a6 pawn, and now that the dust has settled, Magnus is just up an entire, free pass pawn on a2, which is a huge advantage. Wesley tries to solidify the pawn structure by playing g6 just to eliminate the possibility of f5 being a target. However, the main target in this position is actually the e6 pawn. As soon as this queen gets dislodged from the position, e6 hangs. And here, Magnus Carlsen blundered. Rook b5 is a blunder, because after queen takes d4, suddenly this queen attacks f2 with the knight supporting it, and after king h1, queen e1 would be mate. So Magnus takes this pawn with check. Magnus still up a pawn, by the way, and then takes the knight, which is pretty much forced because otherwise queen takes f2 is entirely possible. Wesley recaptures, and this position is close to equal. And now the line here is pretty forced, otherwise white is completely worse. The reason for that is because f2 is once again a big threat, because now this rook and queen both stare at this f2 square. So white has to give this check after the king moves. White drops the queen to e5 with check, forcing a queen trade. Wesley plays rook a8, targeting this passed pawn. Magnus plays knight c6, targeting the e6 bishop, and here, Wesley blunders the game with the move king f7. A much better alternative was to just move the bishop to f8, and the game would still be very, very close. And after the move rook b7, Magnus won the game after Wesley resigned. The reason for that is because the only way to defend this bishop is with the move rook e8, after which a simple trade of pieces would occur, and this position would be completely winning for Magnus because of this passed pawn, which would force the black king to take all this time and move over there in order to eliminate this pawn. Meanwhile, white would just take over these pawns and push his own and quickly promote. This concludes part 1 of the 4-part series on the Aimchess Rapid Tournament Finals between Magnus Carlsen and Wesley So. I hope you guys found this entertaining and instructive. As always, thank you for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.